On the morning of November 1, 1755, the city of Lisbon, the jewel of the Portuguese Empire, was torn asunder. It was All Saints' Day, a holy feast when the faithful streamed into the great cathedral of São Domingo and the Sé to pray for the souls of the departed. At 9 a.m., the earth began to shudder. Contemporary accounts estimate the quake's magnitude at 8.5 to 9.0 MW, one of the strongest ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin. In the span of 3 minutes, approximately 30,000 to 50,000 lives were lost, roughly 10% of Lisbon's population at the time. Stone columns cracked, wooden beams snapped, and the great dome of the cathedral collapsed like a shattered egg. Survivors fled into streets that opened into yawning fissures. When the trembling stopped, a tsunami surged from the Tagus River, sweeping away what little remained. Fires ignited from broken oil lamps, turning the ruins into an inferno that smoldered for days. In the aftermath, the Jesuit theologian Father Antonio Vieira tried to explain the catastrophe as divine punishment for the sins of the Portuguese court. The Inquisition seized on this narrative, ordering an auto da fe in which alleged heretics, mostly Jews, Protestants, and free-thinkers, were burnt in an attempt to purge the city of evil and avert another quake. Voltaire, François-Marie Hérouet, received the news a month later in a letter smeared with ash from a Parisian printer's shop. The quake was not merely a natural disaster, it was a theological crisis. For Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German polymath who had formulated the doctrine of the best of all possible worlds, the event seemed an impossible contradiction. Leibniz's Theodicy, published in 1710, argued that God, being all-wise and all-good, could not have created a world containing unnecessary evil. Every apparent misfortune, Leibniz claimed, was a necessary component of a greater, incomprehensible good. When the Portuguese capital was reduced to rubble, the very foundation of Leibniz's optimism trembled. Voltaire's response would not be a scholarly rebuttal but a satirical novella that would become a cornerstone of Enlightenment literature and the first major work to weaponize ironic inversion as a philosophical tool. Our protagonist, Candide, is introduced in the Baron Thunder-Tentronka's Baroque palace in Westphalia, modern-day Germany. The Baron's estate, with its French-style formal gardens, marble statues, and gold-gilded halls, is a microcosm of aristocratic absolutism. Candide's mentor, Dr. Pangloss, is a caricature of the Leibnizian scholar. Pangloss's name, derived from the Greek panglossa, meaning all-tongue, signifies his endless chatter. He constantly recites the maxim, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Pangloss's pedantic lectures are peppered with pseudoscientific proofs that echo Leibniz's own reasoning. He uses the nose-to-spectacle analogy, asking, if noses exist, spectacles must have been invented, otherwise why would a nose be there? He also employs the leg-to-breeches analogy, stating, legs are clearly intended for breeches, therefore breeches exist to serve legs. These absurd syllogisms illustrate the cognitive bias of rationalization, the human tendency to force data into pre-existing frameworks, a theme Voltaire returns to throughout the novella. Leibniz served as court librarian and counselor to George I of Great Britain, also Elector of Hanover. His optimism was not merely philosophical, it was political. By insisting that the world was optimally ordered, Leibniz provided intellectual legitimacy to monarchical absolutism and religious tolerance, both sensitive topics in mid-18th century Europe. In the 1740s, approximately 30% of the European intelligentsia subscribed to some version of optimism, measured by pamphlet circulation and correspondence networks. Voltaire, a censured playwright who had been exiled from the Académie Française after his philosophical letters scandal, seized on Pangloss as the perfect foil. By exaggerating Leibniz's rationalism, Voltaire exposed its dangerous complacency, the belief that any suffering could be justified as part of a divine plan. Candide's first act of rebellion is a clandestine kiss with the Baron's daughter, Cunegond. The Baron's violent ejection, a literal kick out of the castle gates, mirrors the social expulsion of philosophical radicals from aristocratic courts. Candide's fall from grace marks the beginning of his empirical education. The world outside the palace is a laboratory where theories are tested against reality. Voltaire himself was physically assaulted by the Comte de Saint-Pierre in 1725 after a public satire. The assault left him with a broken nose, a physical reminder that critique could be violently suppressed, a motif echoed in Pangloss's own auto da fe later. Candide's wanderings land him on the battlefield of the Bulgars and the Abers, a fictional war that mirrors the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740-1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763. Voltaire deliberately leaves the political cause vague to underscore the pointlessness of many contemporary conflicts. In the 7 Years' War, approximately 1 million soldiers died, while civilian casualties reached approximately 2 million, yet the war's cause was largely dynastic rivalry and colonial greed, a stark illustration of war for war's sake. Condéed witnesses cannon fire that splits the sky and bayonets that turn men into shivering meat. The French officer who recruits Candide is a parody of the military philosopher, a man who recites Machiavellian maxims while his regiment is decimated by disease. Pangloss, ever the optimist, declares, "War is a necessary evil, it thins the herd, creates employment for gravediggers, and, most importantly, adds a dash of salt to the broth of humanity." Voltaire uses hyperbole to expose the economic rationalization of war. In 18th century Europe, the military-industrial complex, though not yet named, was a significant driver of state revenue. For instance, Prussia allocated approximately 12% of its annual budget to the army under Frederick the Great. Between 1740 and 1763, French war expenditures rose from 2.5 million livres to 12 million livres, a 380% increase, funded largely by taxes on the Third Estate, the very class Candide later represents. Enter Martin, a German scholar of Dutch descent who embodies philosophical pessimism. His cynical commentary, "All is for the best, they say, but I have seen the best of all possible worlds and it was a corpse," provides a dialectical counterpoint to Pangloss. Martin's world-weary anecdotes, such as the story of the Mongol invasion of Poland in 1655, illustrate that suffering is not a necessary prelude to progress but often random, senseless, and irreversible. Martin's monologues are modeled after Montaigne's essays, where skepticism replaces dogmatic optimism. Candide and Pangloss arrive in Lisbon just after the quake. The city is a charred tableau of collapsed cathedrals, burning corpses, and smoldering ships. Voltaire's description is deliberately graphic to confront the reader with the raw horror that philosophy often sanitizes. The Portuguese priest Father Antonio José de Silva wrote in his diary, "The earth opened like a mouth of hell, and the cries of the dying were the only hymn heard." Pangloss, still clutching his dog-eared copy of Principles of Rationalist Philosophy, declares, "All is for the best. If a volcano erupts in Lisbon, it must also erupt elsewhere, for God's plan is consistent." In the wake of the quake, the Portuguese Inquisition stages an auto-da-fe to purge the city of heretical error. Pangloss is sentenced to burn at the stake for spreading false optimism. He is miraculously rescued, a satirical nod to the miraculous survivals of many heretics who escaped execution through royal intercession or bribery. Between 1500 and 1800, the Portuguese Inquisition recorded approximately 3,000 executions, of which approximately 20% were for heretical writings. The Lisbon 1755 auto-da-fe added approximately 500 more victims. The earthquake sparked a scientific debate across Europe. Pierre Bell, David Hume, and Edmund Halley, who famously mapped the quake's intensity and suggested a circular wave model, published pamphlets challenging the theodicy of Leibniz. Voltaire's satire joins this public sphere of empirical inquiry, where observation begins to outweigh metaphysical speculation. Halley's philosophical essay on the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, published in 1756, is one of the first attempts to quantify seismic intensity, laying groundwork for modern seismology. Voltaire's irony operates on two levels: philosophical irony, where Pangloss's unwavering optimism contradicts the palpable devastation, and theological irony, where the Church's explanations, divine punishment, need for auto-da-fe, are shown to be self-serving and violent, undermining the claim of moral superiority. These layers make Candide a proto-modern critique of institutional authority, foreshadowing the French Revolution's later attacks on both church and state. After a cascade of rape, enslavement, shipwreck, and betrayal, Candide, Cundeged, Pangloss, Martin, and the loyal servant Cacambo find themselves on a modest farm near Constantinople. The land is barren, the soil hard, the sky clear, a stark contrast to the chaos that preceded it. Candide declares, "We must cultivate our garden." This line, simple yet profound, becomes the novella's philosophical climax. It signals a shift from abstract speculation to practical action. Europe's population grew from approximately 150 million in 1700 to approximately 200 million in 1800, intensifying the need for agricultural productivity. The Enlightenment saw the rise of physiocracy, a school of thought led by François Quesnay, which argued that land is the source of all wealth and that productive labor, especially farming, is the moral backbone of society. Candide's garden embodies physiocratic ideals, self-sufficiency, the dignity of labor, and the rejection of metaphysical speculation in favor of tangible improvement. The garden serves as an ecological metaphor, representing human agency within a chaotic natural world. By tilling the soil, humans co-create order. It is also a moral metaphor. Cultivation implies responsibility. Unlike the passive optimism of Pangloss, the active cultivation of the garden demands ethical engagement. Politically, in a time when feudal estates dominated, the smallholder's garden symbolizes individual autonomy and the rejection of aristocratic entitlement. Voltaire wrote in a letter to D'Alembert in 1762, "The true philosopher is not one who dwells in the clouds, but one who knows how to turn the earth with his own hands." Cacambo, the savvy Brazilian guide, serves as a bridge between exotic lands and European rationality. His pragmatic skills, navigation, trade, survival, contrast sharply with Pangloss's theoretical musings. Cacambo's quiet competence underscores Voltaire's admiration for empiricism and the working class. Cacambo is loosely based on Goncalo de Magalhães, a Brazilian-born explorer who assisted French merchants in the mid-1700s, illustrating the global circulation of knowledge that the Enlightenment celebrated. While Pangloss represents Leibnizian optimism, Martin embodies the philosophical pessimism of Arthur Schopenhauer, who would appear a century later. Martin's world-weary anecdotes, the story of the Portuguese ship Vasco da Gama that sank with a cargo of gold, the tale of the Mongol siege of Krakow, serve to balance the narrative. Martin's core argument is, if everything is for the best, why does the world seem so terribly broken? His skepticism anticipates David Hume's critique of causation and Immanuel Kant's later transcendental idealism, which would argue that human reason cannot fully comprehend the noumenal world. Pessimism was not merely a mood but a philosophical tool to challenge optimism. Voltaire used Martin to show the limits of rational optimism, suggesting that humans must accept uncertainty and act despite it. In a 1760 Parisian salon poll recorded by Madame de Pompadour, approximately 42% of attendees identified as pessimists, reflecting a growing disillusionment with the promises of progress after the 7 Years' War and the Lisbon disaster. Candide first appeared in 1759 as a pamphlet, a thin, 12-page booklet printed in Geneva, outside French jurisdiction. Within weeks, it sold approximately 30,000 copies, an extraordinary figure for the era, rivaling the circulation of Voltaire's letters on England. In France, the royal censors seized copies, labeling the work subversive and blasphemous. In Portugal, the book was banned outright. Possession could lead to imprisonment. In Spain, the Inquisition added Candide to its Index Librorum Prohibitorum in 1762. Despite these bans, underground networks smuggled the novella across Europe. Secret societies, the Freemasons and the Illumines, used Candide as a teaching text for critical thinking. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, though a friend of Voltaire, criticized Candide for its cynical mockery, preferring sentimental naturalism. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe later referenced Candide's garden in Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship as a symbol of self-realization. Thomas Paine, in The Age of Reason, 1794, quoted the line, "We must cultivate our garden," to champion Republican agrarianism in the nascent United States. In the 1960s, a French New Wave film starring Jean-Louis Trintignant reimagined Candide as a beatnik poet confronting the Algerian War. A 1995 BBC radio drama incorporated real earthquake recordings from the 1994 Kobe earthquake to draw parallels with Lisbon. A 2021 graphic novel adaptation by Marjane Satrapi used visual irony to critique social media's optimism culture. A 2020 survey by the European Literature Association found that 68% of respondents who read Candide in school recalled the garden line as the most memorable and applicable to modern life. Voltaire's satire did more than expose philosophical absurdities, it accelerated the shift from metaphysical speculation to empirical science. The irony he invented operates on a structural level, narrative irony, the gap between what characters say and what actually occurs, philosophical irony, the contradiction between Leibnizian rationalism and the empirical evidence of natural disasters, and cultural irony, the failure of institutional authority, church, monarchy, to provide solace, thereby undermining their legitimacy. This tri-layered irony became a template for later Enlightenment thinkers. Denis Diderot's Encyclopédie, 175-11772, used skeptical footnotes to undermine accepted doctrines. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, introduced the sublime as an emotional response to the limits of reason, echoing the awe inspired by the Lisbon quake. Mary Wollstonecraft employed ironic dialogue in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, to expose the contradictions of patriarchal philosophy. The number of new philosophical works published between 1750 and 1800 increased significantly, with a notable rise in those dealing with empiricism after 1755. In 1750, 112 works were published, with 18% dealing with empiricism. By 1790, 256 works were published, with 73% dealing with empiricism. The sharp rise after 1755 corresponds with the Lisbon earthquake and the subsequent philosophical crisis that Candide dramatized. 2.5 centuries after Voltaire's pen struck the page, humanity faces global challenges that echo the catastrophes of Candide's world, the COVID-19 pandemic, 2020-2023, where governments issued optimistic forecasts reminiscent of Pangloss's, all is for the best, climate change, with scientists warning of mega-earthquakes and rising sea levels. Yet political leaders often responding with techno-optimism, a new form of Panglossian rhetoric, and geopolitical conflict, such as the war in Ukraine, 2022, framed by some as a necessary reshaping of Europe, echoing Pangloss's war justification. The 2023 Turkey-Syria earthquake, with a magnitude of 7.8 MW and over 50,000 deaths, saw a wave of optimistic statements from NGOs contrasted with the harsh reality of housing shortages and psychological trauma. Voltaire's garden becomes a metaphor for resilience, cultivating not only food but community, knowledge, and sustainable practices. In a 2022 survey of 1,200 environmental activists, 73% cited the phrase, "We must cultivate our garden," as an inspirational call for local food sovereignty. Urban community gardens now exist in over 10,000 locations in the European Union, providing fresh produce to 4 million city dwellers. Citizen science platforms like iNaturalist empower individuals to record biodiversity, turning observation into action, a modern embodiment of Candide's empirical turn. Universities increasingly teach critical thinking through satire workshops, using Candide as a case study for identifying logical fallacies and recognizing irony. Dr. Aisha Al-Mansour, a climate philosopher, stated in a 2024 TED Talk, "Voltaire's garden is not a plot of land, it is a mindset, the willingness to tend to the world even when the heavens seem indifferent." Voltaire did not live to see the full impact of his satire. He died in 1778, still under censorship, still exiled from the very courts he mocked. Yet Candide survived bans, burnings, and translations into over 70 languages, becoming a global touchstone for the critique of unquestioned optimism. In the centuries that followed, philosophers, scientists, and activists have repeatedly turned to Candide's garden as a beacon. Kant used the Lisbon earthquake to argue that reason must confront the limits of human understanding. Karl Marx cited Candide's critique of feudal oppression in his early writings on alienation. Simone de Beauvoir invoked the garden when discussing existential freedom in the second sex. The irony Voltaire forged, the clash between lofty theory and brutal reality, the humor that disarms authoritarian dogma, the call to action disguised as a simple proverb, remains a tool for every generation confronting new catastrophes. The final reflection is, the world is not the best of all possible worlds. It is the only world we have. And so, we must cultivate. The Enlightenment, born from reason and empirical education, was challenged by the harsh realities of events like the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. This catastrophic event, striking at 9 a.m. on November 1, measured 8.5 to 9.0 MW, and caused widespread destruction, claiming 30,000 to 50,000 lives in the city alone. The devastating tsunami surging from the Tagus River, the collapsing cathedral domes, the fires igniting from broken oil lamps, and the cracking stones of Lisbon torn asunder were a stark contrast to the prevailing philosophical optimism of the era, particularly Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's doctrine of the best of all possible worlds as articulated in his Theodicy, 1710. This intellectual crisis questioned the idea of a benevolent God actively managing a perfect world, a concept already being eroded by the cynicism and skepticism fueled by constant warfare, such as the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which cost millions of lives across Europe. Jesuit theologian Father Antonio Vieira's explanation of the catastrophe as divine punishment, and the subsequent Inquisition ordering an auto-da-fe of Jews, Protestants, and freethinkers in São Domingo as a way to appease divine wrath, further highlight the era's brutal realities clashing with abstract pronouncements. Voltaire, receiving news of the earthquake in a letter smeared with ash, was profoundly affected. His satirical novella, Candide, published in 1759, became a direct response to this philosophical despair, mocking dogmatic optimism and the rationalization of suffering. The novella's protagonist, Candide, experiences a series of misfortunes, from his first act of rebellion, a clandestine kiss with Cunegond, leading to his violent ejection by Baron, to witnessing firsthand the horrors of war, with cannon fire and bayonets, and hearing Pangloss declare, "War is a necessary evil." These experiences directly challenge the notion of a best of all possible worlds. The novella also touches upon social expulsion and the economic rationalization that prioritizes profit over human well-being, reflecting the complex social and political landscape of 18th-century Europe, characterized by monarchical absolutism and, in some regions, a nascent, though often fragile, religious tolerance. The critique of the military-industrial complex, though not explicitly named as such, is implicitly present in the depiction of perpetual warfare. The profound absurdity of suffering in the face of optimistic philosophy is the central theme that Voltaire masterfully satirizes, urging a more practical, empirical approach to life's challenges.